A quiet lake in the early morning. The camera follows a middle-aged man walking slowly along the edge. He walks alone. His hands are in his coat pockets. The air is still. His face is calm. His eyes look far ahead, not searching, just observing. People see him and whisper, "How sad. He must feel so alone." But the truth is, he has never felt more at peace. Pause. Shift the frame slightly. Zoom in on his expression, then move to a wide shot of the lake. He doesn't rush. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. In this silence, he's not lost. He has found something many often overlook: freedom. Cut to black with the fading echo of footsteps. So, does living alone in middle age always mean being lonely? Smooth transition to the next segment. The camera moves from his footsteps on the path to the eyes of others watching him. Each pair carries a silent judgment. But why are we so quick to label a man as lonely just because he lives alone? Could it be that we're misunderstanding what he truly feels? Here is a fragile line between loneliness and solitude. Two words often mistaken as the same, yet they carry entirely different weights. Loneliness is heavy. It is the sense of being cut off, even when surrounded by others. It is the silence that feels empty, the pause that feels endless, the dinner table with an extra chair no one fills. Solitude, however, is chosen. It is the quiet of a man who walks alone in the park, not because he was left behind, but because he enjoys the rhythm of his own steps. It is a space where silence heals rather than wounds, a place where stillness feels like strength. Psychologists have long observed this distinction. The famous Harvard Men's Study, one of the longest studies on adult life, found that men who embraced solitude with purpose often reported greater peace of mind than those constantly seeking company. When solitude is filled with meaning, it ceases to feel like isolation. It becomes restoration. Yet society rarely sees it that way. Too often, the labels are harsh and careless. You live alone, that must be sad. The assumption is that being alone equals being broken, but the truth is more complex. A man reading by the window, content with his own company, is not always lonely. Sometimes, he is freer than ever before. The challenge lies not in whether one is alone, but in how that aloneness is lived. Is it forced? Or is it chosen? Is it emptiness? Or is it freedom? Understanding this difference is only the first step, because knowing it in theory is far easier than living it in practice, especially in the raw, unsteady moments after a divorce, after a loss, or after life suddenly shifts. The emotions are far from peaceful. They are messy, confusing, overwhelming. And this is where the true journey begins. Because recognizing the difference between loneliness and solitude is one thing, but learning how to walk through those first chaotic nights, when silence feels unbearable, that is an entirely different story. Divorce leaves more than legal papers and empty spaces in a house. It leaves a quiet fracture inside a man's sense of self. In the first months, many experience a fog that is hard to describe. It can look like mild depression, in days where getting out of bed feels heavier than usual. It can feel like guilt, questions that replay endlessly. What could I have done differently? Was it my fault? And for some, it is the ache of feeling unwanted, as if a role once central has been stripped away. This stage is not rare. It is a pattern seen in countless men who find themselves standing alone after years of partnership. Take George, for example, at 51. After 25 years of marriage, his life shifted in an instant. When the divorce was finalized, he described it as if the ground beneath him had cracked. The routines that once anchored him, morning coffee shared at the kitchen table, weekend errands, even arguments that once filled the silence, were gone. In the beginning, he collapsed inward. He withdrew from friends. Food lost its taste. Even music seemed meaningless. Each evening stretched too long, and each night carried the echo of an absence he couldn't name. George admitted he felt useless, like a man who had been pushed out of his own story, like someone discarded. standing at the edge of a life he no longer recognized. But here is the truth: this stage, as painful as it is not a failure. It is a breaking apart, a dismantling of what was once held together. Psychologists sometimes call it a structural collapse, not in the sense of destruction, but as the necessary falling away of a framework that no longer exists. It feels unbearable because the mind resists change. The heart clings to what was familiar. But this unraveling is part of the transformation. It is the body and soul admitting, I cannot go back. I must learn to go forward. To accept this stage is to see it not as the end of a story, but as a crossing point, a threshold that cannot be avoided. It's only walked through. Yes, it is raw. Yes, it is chaotic. But in that chaos lies the seed of renewal. George's collapse was real, but so was his rise. And like many men who endure this fracture, he discovered that even in the darkest weeks, something quiet was forming, a chance to rebuild. Not what he had before, but something different. Something his own. Because time, when used with intention, is not just a healer. It becomes a teacher, and sometimes, even more than that, it becomes a doorway into a life not yet lived. There comes a quiet moment, sometime after the chaos settles, when a man realizes he's no longer afraid to be alone. It doesn't happen with fanfare. It often begins in the smallest places, like waking up on a Saturday morning and not dreading the stillness, no longer wondering how to fill the hours, no longer fearing the empty house. Instead, he opens the window. He watches the light change on the walls. He makes coffee, slowly, without distraction. And somehow, that's enough. The fear that once gripped him during weekends, during holidays, during long evenings, it begins to fade. And in its place, something gentler takes root. Peace. He begins to return to the things he once loved. Fishing, not to escape, but to breathe. Walking, not to get anywhere, but to feel the ground beneath his feet. Reading, not to pass time, but to hear a voice that speaks to him. This is the quiet beginning of becoming whole again. Psychologists call this the phase of positive solitude, where being alone is not a punishment, but a platform for growth, without the need to perform a role, and without the pressure to meet expectations. The self begins to unfold. Freedom becomes fertile ground. In the absence of constant noise, creativity stirs. In the stillness, purpose gently reappears. Mike, 56, had just retired. He lived alone in a small house by the lake. At first, the silence frightened him, but then he picked up a pencil. He hadn't drawn since high school. Each evening, he began to sketch. Nothing complex, just shapes, faces, light. Weeks passed, then months. His home slowly filled with canvases, but more importantly, something deeper filled inside him. For the first time in decades, he said, I feel like I know who I am again. I don't have to explain it to anyone. I just feel it. Mike didn't chase reinvention. He simply allowed rediscovery. And through that process, he realized something many don't. Solitude isn't empty. It's full of things we were once too distracted to notice. Once the external roles fade, husband, worker, provider, what remains is the most important relationship of all, the one we have with ourselves, because when a man is no longer defined by what he does for others, he finally has space to ask, what do I want for myself? And often, the answers don't shout. They whisper, they paint, they walk slowly by the water. When the weight of roles is lifted, something else happens. Emotion becomes free. Real freedom doesn't begin on the outside. It begins within. And for many men, true freedom starts when they step out of roles they never chose, but felt obligated to carry. No longer the only source of strength, no longer the one who must always have the answers, no longer required to be unshakable at all times. For years, they were told to be pillars, to be tough, steady, stoic. But what if being steady doesn't mean being silent? What if masculinity, true masculinity, isn't about hiding emotion, but about honoring it? Emotional freedom means crying when something hurts, without shame. It means choosing stillness, not to escape, but to feel. It means not needing to explain your silence, not fearing judgment for your softness, not measuring your worth by how much you endure alone. This isn't weakness. This is clarity. A man who knows himself no longer proves it through control or force. He doesn't chase approval. He doesn't dominate rooms. He simply shows up, fully, honestly, as he is. This is a new kind of masculinity, not built on power or performance, but on awareness, on calm, on knowing when enough is truly enough. He becomes powerful not by what he controls, but by what he no longer needs to control. He lets go of the pressure to be invulnerable, and by doing so, becomes more human, more present, more free. Because when a man is no longer bound by how others expect him to feel, he opens the door to how he actually wants to live. And from that space, something lasting can be built. Emotional freedom is the foundation, but using that freedom to create a life that matters, that is the deeper work. That is where we go next. Freedom is not just a mindset, it's a rhythm, a daily practice that turns reflection into reality. For the man who has walked through silence, grief, and rediscovery, the next step is not grand. It is grounded, intentional, simple. Start with the morning, not with urgency, but with awareness. Keep a notebook nearby. Write a few lines each day. Not for anyone else, just for yourself. A thought, a feeling, a quiet reminder that your story is still being written. Move your body. Gently. Take a walk without your phone. Feel the air. Notice your breath. Some choose yoga, others find rhythm in golf, or stretching by the window as the sun comes up. Then, from time to time, leave your routine behind. Travel alone, not to escape, but to observe, to be somewhere new, with only your own voice guiding the day. Happiness in solitude isn't passive. It's maintained with care. Create structure, not rigidity, but rhythm. Wake and sleep at steady hours. Keep your space clean. Cook your meals with presence. Connect, but choose wisely. You don't need to be surrounded. You need to be seen. One good conversation is more nourishing than 100 empty exchanges. And be careful with what you feed your mind. Limit time online. Comparison is a quiet thief. You are not late. You are not behind. You are on your own path. And it is unfolding. As it should. Living alone doesn't mean living without purpose. It means building a life that fits who you are now. And when that is done with intention, peace becomes a companion, not a goal. And one day, without even noticing, you may look back and realize something important. This wasn't the ending of something else. It was the beginning of you. Sometimes, loneliness is not a lack of people. It's a lack of truth. Because the loneliest moments are often the ones where we feel unseen. Even in a crowded room, where we hide parts of ourselves just to be accepted. And somewhere in that silence, we begin to disappear from our own lives. But what if solitude isn't absence, but clarity? Carl Jung once said, solitude is where one discovers that one is not alone. Because when you stand still long enough, without pretending, you begin to hear the voice that's always been there, your own. True freedom isn't having no one beside you. It's knowing that no one else defines who you are. And maybe the one who appears alone is not lost at all. Maybe he is simply no longer willing to live by someone else's script. Because the moment you stop being controlled is the moment you begin to live. So if you've ever felt out of place, out of step, or out of sync, perhaps you're not falling behind. Perhaps you're standing at the threshold of becoming. He was never truly alone. He was simply unbound, no longer defined by what he once had to carry, no longer performing a role just to be understood. He had returned, quietly, fully, to himself. So perhaps the next chapter isn't about becoming someone new, but finally having the freedom to be who you already are. And now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever looked at your own loneliness and seen not a void, but a turning point? Have you ever felt that silence, when embraced, could become a form of strength? If that moment has found you, or is finding you now, your story matters. It deserves to be heard. Leave a comment below, not just for you, but for someone else watching who needs to know they're not walking this alone. And if this journey resonated with you, subscribe. Turn on the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Because this isn't the end of something, it's the unfolding of someone. And maybe that someone is finally you.